Hello, I'm Rick Tucker, and this is the special archaeology bonus edition of the Maccabees class that I've been teaching at Adams Boulevard Church of Christ. A few years ago, I taught a 12-week class on archaeology and the Old Testament. And I followed that up a few months later with a 12-week class on archaeology in the New Testament. So as I was finishing up the 13-week class on 1st and 2nd Maccabees, it occurred to me that it might be fun to devote at least one class session on archaeology that relates to the story of the Maccabees. And just a quick disclaimer, I do not consider 1st and 2nd Maccabees to be part of the biblical canon, but I do believe they contain history that's worthy of study. And I explained that during the introduction to the Maccabees class, but I just wanted to state that again in case this archaeology class is the only one that you're listening to. I'm going to cover 6 archaeological discoveries that have some connection to the Maccabees and which I think you'll find interesting. The photo on the title slide, it's not one of them, so I'll just briefly mention that it's a pottery shard bearing the name Hyrcanus. Hopefully you remember from the previous class that 1st Maccabees concludes with John Hyrcanus becoming the high priest and ethnarch over the independent state of Judea, succeeding his father Simon. The pottery shard dates to the right time period, but Hyrcanus was a very common name, so there's no way of knowing for sure, but this might be the same John Hyrcanus. Okay, part 1, the Heliodorus Stela. Now we'll return all the way to the beginning of our story, actually a prologue to the beginning, found in the 4th chapter of 2nd Maccabees. The focus of 2nd Maccabees is the temple in Jerusalem, God's dwelling place, and how God will act to protect his dwelling place. It is the robbery and desecration of the temple by the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV that would motivate the Maccabean revolt. The author of 2nd Maccabees, he gives a prelude of that temple robbery by recounting an earlier attempted robbery that was foiled. In this story, God uses miraculous intervention to protect the temple, whereas later he would use the Maccabees to protect the temple. You might remember this. It's a painting of the expulsion of Heliodorus from the temple by Raphael. Heliodorus was the attempted robber. Antiochus's brother, Seleucus IV, he was still king at the time, and thanks to a little tattletale priest who harbored a grudge against the high priest Onias III, King Seleucus IV learned that the treasure that was kept at the temple in Jerusalem was substantial. Actually, the little tattletale priest really exaggerated it. He was trying to attract the interest of Seleucus IV, try to get him to come and rob the temple and get Onias III in trouble. Well, Seleucus IV, he needed money to pay war reparations that he owed to Rome, so he did send his finance minister, really his chief tax collector, named Heliodorus, to get the treasure that was in the temple. But when Heliodorus arrives at the temple, along with some Seleucid soldiers, he's turned back by 3 spiritual beings who manifest themselves as human beings. The spiritual beings stand on each side of Heliodorus, flogging him unceasingly, as the author of 2nd Maccabees describes it. He would have died but for the high priest Onias offering a sacrifice and asking God to have mercy on him. Then, not only does Heliodorus return to King Seleucus empty-handed, without any treasure, but he even proclaims to the king that Israel's God is supreme. Some think this incident is what Daniel prophesied in Daniel chapter 11 verse 20 when it says, "Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute through the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle." So perhaps the exactor of tribute, that was Heliodorus. The archaeological connection is this. It's known as the Heliodorus Stela, It's owned by a wealthy couple in New York. I've already forgotten their names. Let's just call them Mr. and Mrs. Gottbucks. And Mr. and Mrs. Gottbucks, they have put this on a long-term loan to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Here's the description of the stela from the museum website. The stela documents a correspondence in ancient Greek between Heliodorus and King Seleucus IV, ruler of the Seleucid Empire from 187 to 175 BCE, who was succeeded by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, best known from the story of Hanukkah, and in his letter, King Seleucus announces the appointment of an administrator to oversee the sanctuaries within the province that included the land of Israel. The appointment of an overseer of the sanctuaries, including the temple in Jerusalem, was intended to bring the province into line with the rest of the Seleucid Empire. This position included authority over the sanctuaries' revenues and, above all, taxes due to the king. It is likely, however, that the Jews regarded the appointment as an infringement of Jewish religious autonomy. This episode may have foreshadowed events yet to come. Well, that's how the description ends on the website, and I'd say that's really an understatement, because within 10 years of the making of this stela in 167 BCE, the armies of the new Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV entered the gates of Jerusalem, robbed the temple treasury, massacred the Jewish population, and desecrated the most holy place. By 165 BCE, the land of Judea was in full revolt by the Maccabean priest. The objective of the Maccabean revolt was to restore the temple and covenant worship. So there wouldn't have been a revolt had the Seleucids just left the temple alone. And here we have the document that laid the groundwork by setting out the policy of the Seleucids, which was imperial authority over all sanctuaries in the kingdom. Part 2, the Tomb of the Maccabees. In class session number 12, I read the account of the burial of Jonathan Maccabee at the family tomb in Modi'in. And here's a simple map showing you approximately where Modi'in is located. Actually, I think this might be a little bit off. I don't think Modi'in is that far from Jerusalem, but it is to the north and west of Jerusalem in the direction shown here on the map. Like I said, that was the hometown of the Maccabees, and that's where the revolt began. Judas had already been entombed there, and now it was Jonathan's turn, now that he died in chapter 13. And I'll read that passage again. This is in 1 Maccabees chapter 13, verses 25 through 30. Simon sent for the remains of his brother Jonathan and buried him in Modi'in, the city of his ancestors. All Israel bewailed him with solemn lamentation, mourning over him for many days. Then Simon erected over the tomb of his father and his brothers a monument of stones, polished front and back, and raised high enough to be seen at a distance. He set up 7 pyramids facing one another for his father and his mother and his 4 brothers. For the pyramids he devised a setting of massive columns, which he adorned with suits of armor as a perpetual memorial, and next to the armor carved ships, which could be seen by all who sailed the sea. This tomb, which he built at Modi'in, is there to the present day. My point in reading this the first time was that this tomb sounds more like something befitting Alexander the Great than an Old Testament judge or patriarch. It's not what one would expect from a family willing to lay down their lives to hold to receive Jewish law and resist the forces of Hellenism. But as I was reading it, especially the part about the tomb being there, quote, till this day, you might have wondered whether there are any bits of it remaining today. And indeed, archaeologists have been searching for those graves for 150 years. There are signs marking a tourist site thought at one time to be the spot, but but all the experts agree that that's not it. You can still go there today and you can follow these signs, and you can go to this spot and they have a big Hanukkah celebration there, but it's really just a tourist thing. It's not really the site of the graves of the Maccabees. But in 2015, Israel's Antiquities Authority announced that a possible candidate for the actual gravesite had been found. It's an ancient structure excavated beside a modern highway and thought to have been a mausoleum at one time. It was discovered by a French archaeologist 100 years ago, but then forgotten. His name was Ganot, and I mentioned his name because he made a number of significant discoveries with biblical connections, such as the warning inscription shown here on the left. And we talked about this in my class on archaeology when we covered the New Testament, that this inscription was there on the Temple Mount, and this marked the dividing line between the section where only Jews could go and where anybody else could go. And it says that no non-Jews can go past this point upon pain of death. And like I said, that was discovered by this French archaeologist Ganot. Mention of his name in articles about this more recent Maccabean discovery caught my attention because Ganot was a major character in a book that Janice and I recently read, and that's called The Lost Book of Moses. And yes, at this point I'm getting way off on a tangent, but this is a bonus episode, so I can do that. I'm going to tell you about this book just because I read it and I liked it. I want to tell you about it. So let me tell you what the Moses it's referred to in the title. It refers to Moses Shapira, an antiquities dealer in Israel who attempted to sell to the British Museum some leather strips that, if authentic, would have been from the oldest Old Testament manuscript in existence. If I remember correctly, it was part of the book of Exodus. The book is an investigation into what became of the manuscript and attempts to solve the mystery of its origin. So if you like books on archaeology, with a little bit of mystery, a little bit of adventure, you can check out this book. Well, what you see in this slide is a Byzantine era mosaic cross that was rediscovered in 2015 at this site. The Byzantines would have used this to mark the burial site of a noteworthy biblical character, and the Maccabees would be the only candidates in this area, so it's thought that the Byzantines at least thought that this was the burial place of the Maccabees. We don't know for sure yet because formal professional excavations has not yet been done. Right now they're in the fundraising stage of the process. So once they have enough money, they are going to start excavating in this site to try to prove that it was indeed the tomb of the Maccabees described in chapter 13 of 1 Maccabees. Part 3, the citadel. Throughout this class, I've made references to the citadel, also called the Acra, which is Greek for high fortified place. And that was the fortress built by the Seleucids on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, very near the temple itself. Even after the Maccabees gained control of Jerusalem, the citadel would remain controlled by the Seleucids for another 25 years. It was the last Maccabee brother, Simon, who would finally succeed in taking the citadel after a successful siege. At this time, the Jews considered this to be year one of their restored nation, that they finally took the citadel, so there's no more Seleucid presence there in Jerusalem. So they considered this year one of their new nation. Here is where there's been more recent archaeological news. Remains of the citadel were discovered in 2016 under a parking lot. Before that, scholars knew it had been on the Temple Mount, but they did not know for sure where. According to Josephus, Simon spent 3 years tearing down the citadel so that it would not tower above the temple. The first Maccabees says Simon actually moved into it and made it his residence, so very different accounts. Well, now we know that it's the account in First Maccabees that's the correct one, and it's because of these remains that's been found. And I'll just mention that on this slide you'll see a tiny URL that I created. You can follow that address if you want to read a lengthy article about these remains and what they show. I thought it was very interesting. That's why I included the link. If I remember correctly, it's a National Geographic article that it's worth your time to read that. The dig team found coins that date from the time of Antiochus IV to the time of Antiochus VII, who was the Seleucid king when the citadel fell. They found Greek arrowheads, slingshots, and ballistic stones, and they also found amphorae of imported wine. And since observant Jews drank only local wine, that suggests the presence of foreigners or those influenced by non-Jewish ways. So it's probably the Seleucid soldiers who was drinking that imported wine. At this point, I'm going to go off on another long tangent, but hopefully it's a fun one. If you'll notice on the spearheads here in the image on the slide, you'll see a trident image, and I think it's supposed to be the trident that Poseidon carried, and the 3 points represent Poseidon's dominance over air, land, and sea. And this was also the symbol that Antiochus IV used for his empire. It wasn't used exclusively by him. I think other Seleucid kings used the same image, but it was particularly associated with Antiochus IV. And since Antiochus IV, at least in the book of Daniel, some think is used as a stand-in for the Antichrist, Janice wondered if this is where we get the image of the devil holding a pitchfork. Here we have some of the stereotypical images of the devil holding a pitchfork or a trident. I couldn't resist. I picked a photo of Bill Cosby from the movie The Devil and Max Devlin there on the left. I don't know, maybe Bill Cosby was trying to tell us something. Anyway, the question is whether this image is based on Antiochus IV's use of that image of the trident for the image of his kingdom. The answer is probably not, since the first such depiction that we know of the devil holding a pitchfork or trident is on a carved cross in Ireland in the 9th or 10th century called the Merodach's High Cross. And that's what you see here. You look right in the center, and then just to the right, that's where you'll find the image of the devil, or at least some sort of devilish character holding a trident. And it looks like he's herding lost souls into hell. One of them looks like he was running into hell reading a book. I'm not sure what book you read on your way to hell. Chicken Soup for the Soul, maybe, I don't know. But this is the earliest image we have of the devil holding a pitchfork. Interestingly enough, there's nothing in Scripture about the devil using a pitchfork, but there is for Jesus. And that's in Matthew chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. I baptize you with water for repentance, but after me comes one who's more powerful than I, whose sandals I am not worthy to carry. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor, gathering his wheat into the barn, and burning up the chaff with unquenchable fire. Okay, that's the end of my tangent. We're getting pretty far afield of Maccabees and archaeology, so I'll get us back on track with part 4, the fortress of Tryphon. I talked about Diodotus Tryphon in the last Maccabees class session. He was the only non-Seleucid family member to take the throne of the Seleucid Empire. He's also the one who lured Jonathan into a trap by promising a meeting of peace. He then used the captured Jonathan as a bargaining chip before ultimately executing him as well as his sons. And then everything's going smoothly for Tryphon, sitting on the throne until Antiochus VII, another Seleucid ruler, comes out of nowhere with a new army that puts Tryphon on the defensive. Simon, Jonathan's successor, then joins the war on his brother's murderer, and Tryphon retreats and entrenches his forces in the coastal city of Dor. This is a map that shows the approximate location of the city of Dor on the coast. So this is where Tryphon was holed up when Antiochus's forces were closing in on him. And this is how that's described in 1 Maccabees chapter 15, verses 11 through 14. Pursued by Antiochus, Tryphon fled to Dor by the sea, realizing what troubles had come upon him now that his soldiers had deserted him. Antiochus encamped before Dor with 120,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. While he surrounded the city, his ships closed from the sea, so that he pressed it hard by land and sea and let no one go in or out. So that's how the end of Tryphon is described in 1 Maccabees. We find out later that somehow, even though Tryphon's forces are completely wiped out, Tryphon himself manages to escape, sort of like Darth Vader. But he would be chased down not long after, and he would eventually be executed. Well, just within the last 2 years, the remains of Tryphon's fortress at Dor have been found, and they were submerged in the coastal waters of Dor. And you can see the image there on the right of one of the undersea archaeologists looking at some of the remains. Sorry, I don't have any better photos because all the remains, they're underwater. So there's not much to photograph at this point, but excavation is ongoing, and it appears that the coastal waters have risen there at Dor. So what they thought could in the past have been some of the remains of the fortress that was up out of the water turns out not to be it. That the fortress was on part of the coast that's now completely submerged. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from the article that I found in an Israeli newspaper telling about this. It says that until recently, scholars believed that the massive wall that surrounded Tel Dor and the city in the northern part of the bay was the line of defense for Tryphon and his troops. Arrowheads and slingshots from that battle were also discovered there. Some of the stones are etched with a lightning bolt, the symbol of Zeus, and others bear the inscription "Victory over Tryphon." But 3 months ago, researchers discovered underwater on the southern side of the port, an area where no structures from any period had been found, the remnants of a large fortification. Its similarity to another fortification on land and other artifacts led researchers to date this fortification to the Hellenistic period. Now it appears that this fortification, situated in the area, was likely Tryphon's first line of defense and the northern sea wall his second line of defense. Part 5, the Hasmonean Winter Palaces. Starting with John Hyrcanus, the Hasmonean rulers built winter palaces west of ancient Jericho. Ehud Netzer of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem excavated 4 different Hasmonean palaces. His reports try to answer the question of whether the Hasmoneans were more Jewish or Hellenistic in their lifestyles. Just to refresh your memory, here's the family tree of the Maccabees. You can see we started off the story with Mattathias there at the top. He's the father of the 5 Maccabee brothers. Mattathias, he's the one that ran through with a sword a Seleucid official when they were trying to to force the people of Modain to offer pagan sacrifices, and that touched off the revolution. In First Maccabees, the last ruler of the Maccabees family and the founder of the Hasmonean dynasty, Simon Maccabeus, is characterized as pious with regard to the Torah and the Jerusalem temple. However, the Jewish historian Josephus portrayed the Hasmoneans as Hellenistic rulers who hired Greek mercenaries and mistresses and enjoyed banquets. So which image is more accurate? That's the question. Were the Jewish kings that came after Simon, were they more like the Greek rulers, more Hellenistic, or were they holding to the Jewish ways? Netzer's surprising discovery was that the palaces that they built got progressively smaller and less opulent, which is the opposite of what you'd expect. I mean, kings don't typically tear down palaces to build smaller ones, but that seemed to be what was going on here. The first palace, known as the Buried Palace, was built by John Hyrcanus, who was high priest and ethnarch, but who never took the title of king. The latter and more modest fortified palace was built by Alexander Eunaeus, who took the title of king. Here's a drawing of what it would have looked like, and believe it or not, this was more modest than the palace of John Hyrcanus. But notice most of what you see are the grounds, including 2 large pools. The actual palace there in the upper left, it's not really all that huge. And here is what the excavated grounds looks like, though the image is turned around, so now the palace is on the right side instead of the left side. The palace that would come after this one was even smaller. So there appears to be an inverse correlation over time between royal status, specifically the adoption of the title of king, and the external display of power and luxury. So the speculation is that because the Hasmoneans believe that one way to assume the title of king, despite not being of the tribe of Judah, that is, from the Davidic dynasty, was to appear less opulent to the subjects than their predecessors who did not adopt the title of king. So in other words, they must have been a little bit self-conscious about calling themselves king, so they made up for that by saying, well, look how simple and humble I am. I'm not living the life of a high king living in luxury. So maybe you'll give me a pass on calling myself king, like somebody being in the line of King David. Well, as for the elaborate pools and gardens, which are indeed much like what other more Hellenized rulers of the time had, those were not made an integral part of the Hasmonean king's domestic units. Rather, they were open to the public and not treated as the king's personal property. So it would seem that the Hasmonean kings, they cared enough about what the average Jew on the street thought of them that they maintained at least an outward appearance of piety and humility. So that raises the question, but what were they really? I mean, how did they really live behind closed doors where the average Jew on the street couldn't see them? Well, the archaeological record reflects that even here they were more pious than other kings. The inside of these palaces were simple by comparison. The mosaics were simple geometric designs, free of any images of animals or people. And Hellenistic palaces normally contain splendid vessels for feasting and banquets, but the Hasmonean high priests and kings seem to prefer common vessels. Here are samples of what were found, and all of this stuff incidentally was found dumped in a mikveh, or a ritual bath. The odd looking thing there in the back, that's called a rhyton, R-H-Y-T-O-N, and That was the only nice imported item that was found there. The rest of this stuff is all simple pottery that would have been made locally. And speaking of mikvahs, if you'll recall, if you were in my New Testament archaeology class, we talked quite a bit about mikvahs. Those are ritual baths that Jews would have used at the time for cleansing rituals, and they would completely submerge themselves. So it's kind of leading up to baptism by immersion that we'd read about in the New Testament. So when John the Baptist came and started baptizing people, it wouldn't have seemed that unusual because the Jews at the time were used to already submerging themselves as part of their cleansing ritual. And they would use these mikvahs to do that. And these mikvahs, they were found throughout the palace areas here at this site and outside of Jericho that we're talking about. And here's an example of that. This one was built by King Alexander Eunaeus in the industrial area east of the Hasmonean Palace Zone. The one with the steps is the mikveh. The other stepless small pool is called a treasury. A treasury would be connected to the mikveh by a channel or a pipe used to purify the water of the mikveh, since drawing water would invalidate it for ritual immersion. So the water that would fill up the mikveh would have to flow into it rather than being poured into it. The many mikvehs found at these sites are not only evidence that those living in the palaces observed ritual purity, but that the Hasmoneans invited palace guests and visitors to maintain religious observance and piety, in addition to enjoying the recreational facilities of the gardens, pools, and hot bathtubs. And remember that Hasmoneans were also high priests and consistently observed ritual purity in their private and public domains. Then again, just having a mikveh does not make one a model Jewish priest. I mean, even King Herod built mikvahs for himself and his family at each of his palaces. Here's the one at the fortress at Maccabees on the east coast of the Dead Sea. That's where Herod's son, King Herod Antipas, had John the Baptist executed. So perhaps that King Herod used this very cleansing bath before or after having John's head severed. So who knows? Part 6, Tomb of Israel's Last King. And by Israel's last king, I'm not referring to the true King of Kings. I ended the last Maccabees class session with an epilogue summing up the Hasmonean era and telling of how the Maccabee family dynasty would ultimately end. I told of the civil war that broke out between Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, the sons of Israel's only Hasmonean queen. This civil war ended with Pompey of Rome coming in on the side of Hyrcanus II, the weaker of the two princes. He allowed Hyrcanus to rule as a puppet king, but Judea was made a province of Rome. Pompey made it clear who was boss by personally entering the Holy of Holies in the temple at Jerusalem. And here's a painting depicting that. This is depicting that event painted in the 1400s. Herod the Great is appointed as governor of Rome at this point. And what I left out when I told that story was that there was one final push for independence by someone in the Maccabean family line, and that was Antigonus II, the son of Aristobulus. With the help of the Parthians, who had already invaded Syria, Rome was driven out of Judea. The Parthians helped Antigonus because they preferred having an anti-Roman king on the throne. That, plus Antigonus promised them a large sum of gold and 500 female slaves if they would help him out. So Hyrcanus is deposed, and he has his ears mutilated and sent to Babylon in exile. And I talked a little bit about that in the very first Maccabees class, that the reason why Antigonus would have mutilated his his ears is so that now he's can no longer serve as high priest, following Old Testament law. So what happens at this point after Hyrcanus is sent to exile? Antigonus is on the throne. Herod, he has to flee Jerusalem. Antigonus is proclaimed king and high priest, but his reign would only last about 3 years. His own coins, that's what you're seeing here, is these coins during the reign of King Antigonus. His reign was short because Rome was not done with Judea. Herod had made his way to Rome, which is now ruled by Mark Antony, and in the Senate chamber in Rome, Herod is proclaimed the king of Judea. He returns to Judea with a Roman army. He conquers all of Judea except for Jerusalem, and Jerusalem would then fall the following year after a siege launched by Herod. The supporters of Antigonus fought until the Romans reached the inner courtyard of the temple. Antigonus was then taken to Antioch and executed, thus ending Hasmonean rule. And Antigonus can, in this sense, be considered Israel's last king, at least Israel's last earthly king. Josephus, in his writings, he states that Mark Antony beheaded Antigonus, but Roman historian Cassius Dio says that he was crucified, and he records in his Roman history this: "These people," meaning the Jews, "Antony entrusted to a certain Herod to govern, but Antigonus he bound to a cross and scourged, a punishment no other king had suffered at the hands of the Romans, and so slew him." Well, this is a very interesting description of Israel's last king, considering this occurred only 37 years before the birth of Christ. I'm thinking about Matthew chapter 27, verse 37, describing the crucifixion of Jesus, when it says that they put over his head the accusation written against him, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." So just think that in some sense, Jesus was not the first Jewish king crucified on a cross. I had no idea before I did this study. Well, this is a long setup to explain an archaeological discovery made in the 70s, and which has sparked debate ever since. Here's the beginning of an article in an Israeli newspaper. In 1970, a rock-cut tomb was discovered by workers building a private house in Jerusalem's Givat Hamiftar neighborhood. Inside the two-chambered burial, dating back to the 1st century BCE, archaeologists found a decorated ossuary, a limestone box containing the bones of the deceased, and an enigmatic Aramaic inscription affixed to the wall. "I am Abba, son of Eleazar the priest," proclaimed the 2,000-year-old text. "I am Abba, the oppressed, the persecuted, born in Jerusalem and exiled to Babylon, who brought back Mattathiah, son of Judah, and buried him in the cave that I purchased." Who was Abba, this unfortunate priest from Jerusalem? And who was the Mattathiah, whose remains were apparently buried in the cave? Here's a photo of the ossuary that was discovered. And in the lower right-hand corner is a photo of a jawbone and possibly a crucifixion nail that was found inside the ossuary. I talked a lot about ossuaries in my New Testament archaeology class. This burial practice had not yet been adopted by the Jews when the Maccabees were buried in the family tomb in Modi'in, but it had been adopted by the time of Aristobulus' death, and it was the common practice during Jesus' time. The deceased would be placed in a tomb for a year until all the flesh would rot away, and then the bones would be gathered and placed in an ossuary such as this one. So this is probably Jesus was referring to in Luke chapter 9, verses 59 and 60. And he said to another, "Follow me." But he said, "Lord, permit me first to go and bury my father." But he said to him, "Allow the dead to bury their dead, but as for you, go and proclaim everywhere the kingdom of God." Well, the reluctant disciple here isn't saying, "Just give me enough time to attend my father's funeral and then I will be on my way with you." What he's saying is, "Give me a year, and then when I gather my father's bones and put them in the ossuary, then I will be free to follow you." So anyway, when this ossuary was discovered in 1970, the speculation was that it was the ossuary of Antigonus, whose name was also Mattathiah, the name mentioned in the inscription. It is one of the most ornate ossuaries ever found, befitting the ossuary of a king and high priest. It was also buried in a hidden way, which is how Antigonus would have had to be buried during Roman rule. Remember, he was executed by the Romans. Here's a little bit more from the article. Interviewed for a program titled "The Last of the Maccabees," Haas said he had identified the bones of at least two individuals, one older and one a young adult around the age of 25 who had suffered a horrific death. 3 nails were found in the ossuary with pieces of hand bones attached to 2 of them, suggesting the victim had been crucified. Haas also identified clean cuts on the man's second vertebrae and lower jaw, indicating he had been decapitated with a sword or other sharp object. These findings were consistent with Mattathiah's age and with the account of his execution given by ancient historians Josephus Flavius and Dio Cassius, who recount that Mark Antony had the king crucified, scourged, and beheaded. So it sounds like all the pieces fit together pretty well, right? But when another anthropologist concluded that the jaw was from an elderly woman, doubt entered the picture. I mean, she also did not think that the nails had pierced the bones, so it was not a crucifixion. She concluded that this must not be the ossuary of Antigonus. So for most experts, this settled the matter. But just last year, a new study was done of the bones, and it was concluded that they are the bones of an execution, and the jawbone is of a man. Also, the name Abba, who wrote the inscription, fits with a known family who were loyal to the Hasmoneans and opposed Herod during his reign. The previous anthropologist, she still holds to her conclusion, so the debate continues. It goes back and forth, much like the debate over whether the Shroud of Turin is legitimate or not. And as with so many archaeological discoveries relating to the Bible, there's really no definitive answer here, so I'm leaving you with this mystery. So whose bones are in the box? Are they the bones of Israel's last earthly king, crucified on a Roman cross? It's also a good place to end this class on archaeology and the whole class on the Maccabees, and I'll do so by repeating the words of Jesus. "Allow the dead to bury their own dead, but as for you, go and proclaim everywhere the kingdom of God."